Well, good afternoon. Today is, what is this, week 9? Week 9 of the chronological Bible study that we're doing. And so today I was going to just kind of do the book of Numbers. Even though next week we'll have some of the book of Numbers, I just kind of wanted to kind of hit across some of the high points and maybe kind of talk a little bit about the book of Numbers. All right, the book of Numbers is kind of a weird title, isn't it? Numbers. Where did that come from? Well, if you notice, if you're reading this, there's 2 times that God tells Moses to take a census of the people for military size purposes and for the layout of it. And so taking a census is what? It's counting, and so that's where this comes from. So that's where the title of the book of Numbers comes from. Who wrote it? Well, Moses does. This book is a historical narrative that picks up about 1 year from the time that they left Egypt after the Passover. Almost 1 year. Okay, that's where this book picks up. Now, so Exodus covered from basically Moses' birth, and then of course his 40 years that he's in Pharaoh's household. Then he goes off and he ends up out in the wilderness for 40 years, right? And then God sends him back. So it covers about an 80-year period that it covers. Then the book of Leviticus really covers from when they leave Egypt, and it covers that first 1 year period where they going up there and God's got him up on the mountain and he's talking to Moses and he's giving him the law and all those things that come out. And then from that, they do what with the book of Leviticus? They take the instructions God gave to make the tabernacle and all those different pieces that go inside the tabernacle. So all that comes out. So that's that first year afterwards. That's where then the book of Numbers picks up. Now the book of Numbers, though, is a little bit unique in the fact that it covers basically the next 39 years. Okay, so this piece of narrative history here covers a wide range of time. So it's not like Moses sits down on, at about the 1.5 year mark and writes this whole thing out, because this is going to play out over 39 years. So what's he doing? Keeping journals? Maybe, but he's writing this. Maybe he's writing it along as they go. But that's the book of Numbers, is this historical narrative that lays out this next 39 years. Now here's the sad part about the book. We get to see how they fell and the consequences of how they fell. Okay? And what happens because of that. All right? But Yahweh, God, the God of Israel, Yahweh, the one true living God, He's the main character in this. Okay? And what we see is His holiness, His requirements, His commands, His purposes, His desires. All these things that we see about God, we're going to see in this book. And it's lived out in full display of the sovereign God dwelling in the midst of His people. Okay? That's the book of Numbers over a 39-year period. Okay? Now, God's holiness and God's purity require the same from His people, regardless of the reason or excuse. Let me say that again. God's holiness and His purity require the same from His people, regardless of excuse or reason. Okay? If y'all remember, last time we even talked about, when we were in the book of Leviticus, sin that was what? Even if you didn't even mean to, you didn't even know it, intentional or unintentional, okay, there was still guilt. Or disease or different things that made you unclean, whether you meant to or not, was still what? It was still unclean. Why? Because the one true living God was tabernacling. He was in the midst of His people. And so regardless of what the reasoning was, the people had to be clean and holy before Him, no matter what the reason was. Anything else was unacceptable and had to be where? Outside the camp. Okay? So, now Moses is the primary person that God uses to communicate through and direct through. The primary person. Now, there are others that are, but to a much lesser degree. Matter of fact, through this book, we'll see several different people, and we won't talk about them all, but we'll see several different times Moses' authority was challenged. And to be honest with you, it didn't end well for any of them. Matter of fact, it didn't end well for any of them. It was a bad situation. Now, the sad nature of this book is that it reflects the unbelief of the people after they saw everything that God did for them. Okay? And thus the consequences that first generation suffered, they don't get to go in, they don't even get to see the promised land. These are the ones that had spent their lives as slaves, 20 years old and older, spent their lives as slaves. They're going thinking, I'm getting to go to the promised land. We're getting this land, this place that's milk and honey. It's flowing with everything we could ever have. A good land, and we're going to have safety, and we're going to be there. And they did not get to even see it. Why? Because of the consequences of their rebellion against God and their unbelief. Okay? So these are some of the things that we see. But even throughout all that, God's grace and His redemptive plan is still in place. Okay? Because He could have dropped them all dead. Okay? But not only His redemption and His grace, but also He made a promise. Y'all remember Genesis chapter 15? What did God do? God took and He took and had him split the animals, and God made a promise and said, do this. And God's going to keep His promise. Bad side is the consequence. They're not going to get to live in it. Okay? So those are the things that we're going to be able to see through this. So even with all the rebellion and all the issues that they have, God is part of the promise. Now, how do we take and deal with the Old Testament, and in this case, the book of Numbers, with our understanding and how we use it today? That's a good question. With any of the Old Testament, that's actually a good question. Romans chapter 15 says this in 15 verse 4. For whatever was written in the past was written for our instruction. Whatever was written in the past. So what would have been the past? The book of Numbers? The book of Leviticus? All these things that were Old Testament, that was written in the past. It's written for what? Our instruction, right? Now, similarly, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul writes the very thing in this book as well. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 6 and following says this, now these things took place as examples for us, so that we will not desire evil things as they did. All these things in the past took place as example, so that we desire the evil things like they did. So that means that the Bible's back to what things in the past. Well, as I keep going here, most of the things this is talking about come straight from the book of Numbers. Okay? So Paul writing in the New Testament, and he's pointing back where? To the book of Numbers and saying all these things are so we won't do what? We won't go and start desiring the evil things. We will learn from what they suffered from. Okay? And then it says, verse 7, don't become idolaters, as some of them were, as it was written. The people sat down to eat and drink, got up to party. Let us not commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in a single day 23,000 people died. Let us not test Christ as some of them did, and were destroyed by snakes. We'll talk about that one real briefly today. And don't complain as some of them did, and were killed by the destroyer. All these things happened as examples, as they were written for our instruction. So does that mean that the Old Testament still applies today? Sure does, doesn't it? I mean, there it is. If Paul's writing this to the first century church, he's writing that to us as Christians, because this is this side of the cross, right? So regardless of what we think about the Old Testament, it's pointing back, right back to the Old Testament. Okay? So the book of Numbers, so keep this in mind as we're looking through some of these things, that it is for the purpose that we learn so that we don't desire the evil things like they did. Okay? Now let's jump back You jump back over here to the book of Numbers. Now, let's just take a journey through part of the book of Numbers and see what some of these things are that the Bible's pointing us to that says, let it be our instruction, our example, okay? So, in chapter 1, right there at the beginning of chapter 1, this is talking about, and this is one of those sections where you get where the book title comes from. This is taking a census, okay? We're not going to talk about that, but that's what this part is. But chapter 5 gets you to the first spot here. Chapter 5, the first thing it deals with is again about skin diseases and about being unclean. Look at chapter 5, verse 1. The Lord instructed Moses, command the Israelites to send away anyone from the camp who is afflicted with a skin disease, anyone who has a discharge, or anyone who is defiled because of a corpse. Send away both male and female. It doesn't matter. Either one. Okay? Send away both male and female. Send them outside the camp so that they will not defile their camps. And then look at what it says, where I, God, dwell among them. Again, what's the reasoning? Because the holy God of Israel is there. He's tabernacling with them. And He not only requires them to be holy, but He requires them to be pure. Regardless of the reason why, He still requires it. Okay, why? Because He's holy. He's holy God. Okay? So the first thing you see right there is the skin diseases, but it comes back to the fact that what's going on here? It doesn't matter if this is something you planned on. It doesn't matter how you ended up there. God says what? Be clean. Okay? Be clean. Then the next thing there is, in my Bible here, that little heading says compensation for wrongdoing. It's if you've wronged somebody else. So the second thing right here in this chapter is if you've wronged somebody. Okay? Chapter 5, verse 6. Tell the Israelites, when a man or woman commits any sin against another, that person acts unfaithfully toward the Lord and is guilty. Okay, so first thing you notice is if you commit a wrong against somebody, it's not just against them, it's against God. You're guilty. Even if it's just against this person. It's against that person, it's against God, and you're guilty. Okay? And then what does he say, verse 7? The person is to confess the sin he's committed. Confess means to what? Admit it, right? Admit that I've sinned. He's to confess the sin he's committed. He's to pay full compensation, add a fifth of its value to it, and give it to the individual he's wronged. So it's to make restitution. If you've wronged somebody, in this case, you would be what? So if they would have stolen their animal, they're to give them the animal plus a fifth more in value added to it. They're to confess that they've done it. But is that the end of it? Because that just kind of deals with the person, right? The end of verse 8 says, along with the atonement ram, which the priest will make atonement for the guilty person. So you sinned against the person, you've got to deal with that. But then God says what? You sinned against me, you're guilty. So what has to happen? There had to be a blood sacrifice. Okay? There had to be a ram given as atonement. There had to be a blood sacrifice to pay for the sin against the holy God of the universe. Okay? So that's the next thing. And then after this one, this third one here, the heading here says jealousy ritual. I looked it up in a couple of other versions to see what they had in the heading. One of them had marital faithfulness. The other one had a test for adultery. This one's kind of an interesting thing when you read through this one because, well, just by the nature of it, it's just kind of maybe a little challenging. But if you look at verse 12, speak to the Israelites and tell them, if any man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him and sleeps with another, it is concealed from her husband, and she is undetected, even though she has defiled herself, since there is no witness against her and she hasn't been caught in the act, And if a feeling of jealousy comes over the husband and he becomes jealous because of his wife who has defiled herself. This jealousy, probably a better understanding of that is somebody who becomes suspicious. Okay? If he becomes suspicious, there's been no reason. She hadn't been caught doing anything, and she sure hadn't confessed to anything, but he just all of a sudden comes out of this fog that guys get in sometimes, and comes in and just starts, there's some suspicion, thinks something's going on. Or if a feeling of jealousy comes over him and he becomes jealous of her, though she has not defiled herself. If he becomes suspicious of marital unfaithfulness, okay, whether it's true or not, if he just has become suspicious is what this is dealing with. Now, here's why it gets a little challenging to deal with this. Why is it just the wife? Look, I'm a guy with nothing but a wife and daughters, okay? So I'm going to look at this from multiple aspects because I got all these daughters, right? So I'm looking at, why is it just the wife? Well, I don't know, maybe men are dumb if it comes to sex stuff. We really are. Look, men get caught real easy. Okay? We're just, we don't, it ain't the same with guys and females. Men and women deal with this issue differently. And we can be kind of dumb when it comes to this stuff. Right? Men get caught easier. Okay? Whether it's locker room talk, it's bragging, whatever. Okay? Men get caught easier with this stuff. Okay? So men are, when it comes to sexual immorality, men are stupid. Okay? Hey, now, women, on the other hand, are smarter. But to make sure I offend both sides of this equally here, I don't mean smarter in a good way. Because I really mean it more as can be manipulative or deceptive. Okay? And I get it. I'm talking to a room of women right now. Okay? And in case you're wondering what's got, everybody's shaking their head like this in agreement. All right? Now, why is that? But they can be more discreet. Okay? And so if a woman's trying to hide stuff, especially in this case, she's usually better than a guy is at it. Okay? So I think that's part of what it is. But here's the deal. What's the penalty if they were caught in the act? The penalty for both male and female both was death. The penalty didn't change. Okay? So I think this is maybe why God's dealing with this one. Because women this can be an issue that they can it can be hid a little bit more. Okay? Now, look down at verse 16. The priest is to bring her forward, have her stand before the Lord. Then the priest will take holy water in a clay bowl, take some of the dust from the tabernacle floor and put it in water. Now that's kind of interesting. Dust from the tabernacle floor. So they're supposed to sweep some dirt up off the floor, put it in a water mixture because she's going to drink it. Now look, let me, because if you take it on the surface, that sounds kind of strange. But let me ask you something. Where did it say that the dust came from? The tabernacle floor, which is the Holy of Holies. Not the Holy of Holies, but in the holy place. My guess is that's pretty clean anyway. But this is dust. This has been where? In the presence of the Lord. Okay? So it's to take that. I get it. It sounds strange to us today, but this is what it was. Okay? Now then look over at 27. When he makes her drink the water, she's got to make a pledge, and then she's got to drink the water. If she has defiled herself and been unfaithful to her husband, the water that brings a curse will enter her to cause bitter suffering. Her belly will swell and her womb will shrivel. She will become a curse among her people. But if the woman has not defiled herself and is pure, she will be unaffected and will be able to conceive children. What did that just say? Who just determined whether she was innocent or guilty? God and God alone. Nobody else. He's the only one that knew the correct answer. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I think that'd be a bad spot to be in, wouldn't you? Especially if you're guilty. Because, I mean, look, if you knew you were guilty and you got to stand before God and He's the only one that knows, you hadn't hid anything really, have you? Okay? So the God who sees and knows all is the one who's going to confirm the truth one way or the other. Okay? You wouldn't want to envy her for being in that spot. Okay? Now, why is this important? Well, the marriage bed, God holds extremely important. Okay? This is dealing with marital faithfulness. You think that's changed any in our day? Does that change any? No. See, the New Testament also, all over it, tells us to abstain from sexual immorality. Okay? So, doesn't matter which side, Old Testament or New Testament, God set all this in place, and God's the one that laid it. And here's how it is. Okay? Now, just because somebody gets away with something today in the short run, okay? Just because culture says something's okay, just because there's a secretiveness, nobody knows. Maybe it's an open relationship, so maybe both parties know and agree to it, okay? Well, we think nothing happens in the short run, okay? Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt anybody, right? I mean, it's two consenting adults. Okay? Just because of all of that, still, one of these days, we're going to stand before the one God of the universe that knows the truth. Even if we did something in secret now. Okay? So just because we may get away with something today, okay, one of these days, we're going to stand before God, who knows it all. And by the way, Jesus threw one extra little caveat in there when He was talking about it, because it ain't just how you act, it was also what you think. If you've had those thoughts, you're still guilty. Okay? Basically, everybody's guilty, okay, dealing with this. Okay? God knows it. Every person will one day stand before Him. Now, chapter 9 deals with the second Passover. The first Passover happened about a year beforehand when they come out of Egypt. Now this time, see, God told them back then, said, you're going to do this every year. It's going to be done in remembrance every year. Now here they get to the time that we're coming up on the anniversary of it, and they're not to the promised land yet. They're still out there on their journey. But God doesn't give a pass for it. He tells them, no, we're still going to do this. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. In the first month of the second year, after their departure from the land of Egypt, the Lord told Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, the Israelites are to observe the Passover at its appointed time. You must observe it at its appointed time on the 14th day of the month at twilight. You are to observe it according to all its statutes and its ordinances. It didn't go away. And it didn't get a reprieve for, we'll wait till you get into the promised land. We're going to start it right now. Okay? Now, move over to chapter 11. Here's some of those things that we can learn that tie back into the New Testament side of things. Chapter 11 starts off the heading there, complaints. The complaint department of God is not, there really should probably be a sign. If you had a picture of a door for the complaint department in heaven with God, it would say probably come back another time. Okay? Why? God really ain't wanting to listen to complaints. Okay? Now, chapter 11 starts with the people complaining before the Lord. Look at chapter 11, verse 1. Now the people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. When the Lord heard, His anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. God burned up some folks for doing what? Complaining. Then the people cried out to Moses, and he prayed the Lord, and the fire died down. Okay? Complaining. Look, have they had a history of this? Look, you can go back through the book of Leviticus. You can go back through the book of Exodus. They had a history of complaining. Okay? And it never ended well. Okay? Complaining. And they're always, and look, what do they usually complain about? Somewhere in there, they're complaining because they're not getting what they think they deserve, and they start saying what? You know what? When we were back in Egypt, we had all this. Okay? So they were complaining. Verse 4, the riffraff. I love that part. The riffraff. That just tells you, starting off, that you got that, just those people that cause trouble, right? The riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. The Israelites wept again and said, "Who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt." Free fish you ate in Egypt? You were slaves. But hey, memory's short. Along with the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at but this manna. Hey, God's providing them what? Basically the bread from heaven every morning, and they're already complaining, "Oh, we got this old stinking manna." Okay? Now, skip over to verse 18. God's dealing with their complaints from His complaint department. Tell the people, "Consecrate yourselves in readiness for tomorrow, and you will eat meat, because you've wept in the Lord's hearing. Who will feed us meat? We were better off in Egypt. The Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it. You will eat it not for 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but for a whole month. I'm going to give you more than you ever thought was coming." Okay? "Until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes nauseating to you." Oh, you wanted meat? You wanted to complain? I'm going to give you some. Okay? "Because you have rejected the Lord who is among you." See, when you're just reading it over there and they're complaining about it, well, it's almost like, okay, well, here are the facts, no big deal. But the Lord didn't see it that way. Okay? It was an offense to God. Okay? Who was providing for them, and they're still looking back and forgetting how bad Egypt was. Okay? "Because you've rejected the Lord who is among you and wept before Him, why did we ever leave Egypt?" Okay? Skip down to verse 23. The Lord answered Moses, "Is the Lord's arm weak? Now you will see whether or not what I have promised will happen to you." Okay, and then look over at verse 31. "A wind sent by the Lord came up, blew quail in from the sea. It dropped them all around the camp. They were flying 3 feet off the ground for about a day's journey in every direction." That's a lot of birds. 3 feet off the ground, a day's journey. I mean, that's miles in every direction. Okay? They were that many of them. Okay? And verse 32, "The people were up all day and all night, and all the next day gathering the quail. The one who took the least gathered 50 bushels. That's a lot. Okay? And they spread them out all over the camp. While the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed, the Lord's anger burned against the people, and the Lord struck them with a severe plague." He didn't just feed them. Those that had been doing the complaining, there was judgment coming. So they named that place whatever it is, because they had buried the people who had craved meat. Those who had been complaining and craving and complaining about the Lord, they got buried there. Okay? They got buried there. This is a cycle that they had, that they constantly dealt with. And every time they had these complaints, the reality was there was a divine judgment came on them. Okay? They always were getting caught back up in complaints. Now, chapter 12, I just want to look at it real briefly. This is one of those times that you had somebody challenging Moses' authority who God had established. And who is it coming from? His sister and his brother. Okay? Miriam and Aaron, chapter 12, criticized Moses because of the Cushite woman he married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Okay? Now, look, there's no consensus on who this is. Some believe that this was Zipporah that he had been before, because those people, the Midianites and the Cush, were really the same people group, because there's some other references to them. Okay, so or was this something else? Don't know really, but they didn't like it. They didn't like her, but that's not the real issue. That was two jealous people, really probably one more so than two. But that was jealousy, and they were having something to complain about that Moses had done. Okay? Verse 2, they said, "Does the Lord speak only through Moses?" See, this is deeper than just who he married. Okay? Be us too, right? Does he not speak through us? And the Lord heard it. The Lord's listening. And then here's where it says, Moses was a very humble man, more than anyone on the face of the earth. Now, he didn't get that way from when he left Egypt. He got that way from being out in the wilderness for 40 years. God softened him up, and he became a humble man. Okay, but here they are, and they're complaining. What's going to happen? God's going to bring them out there, and basically, Miriam's going to be the one that's going to suffer the consequences with the skin issue. Now, why didn't Aaron? I don't know. I got a feeling because he was the high priest, and he probably was a secondary level on this. This was probably more her kind of running off and complaining and having this little power trip that she was looking at this one point, and she was going, well, God speaks through us too. Why him? Okay? But it doesn't really give us all of it. But what I do know is that both her brothers had to jump to her defense with the Lord, especially Moses. Okay? Now, so she's going to get to go outside the camp for a little while. Okay? Now, that was that. Now, chapter 13 and 14. Chapter 13 and 14 are the pivotal point in the history of Israel, because they were on a journey that was going to lead them to the promised land. And because of chapters 13 and 14, what they're going to end up is they're going to end up with an extra 40 years out there because of, well, rebellion and unbelief. Now, chapter 13, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, "Send men to scout out the land of Canaan I am giving to the Israelites. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes." Now, that says that the Lord told them to go, right? Well, let me put something here that you can wrestle with. Deuteronomy, which is the next book we'll deal with, Deuteronomy picks up where Numbers closes out. And the beginning of Deuteronomy is really a summary, getting you pumped back into it. And it's talking right here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 22. And Moses says that the people approached him and wanted him to send them. But this says God said, right? What is it? My guess is it's probably both. Probably, remember, these people have been doing a whole lot of complaining. And so maybe they're complaining and they're going, is this really worth it, kind of thought process. We ought to send somebody to go see. And God probably agrees and tells Moses, send some people into the land and let them go check it out. Okay? So I think it probably is true that it came from God, but this is from the people and their questioning, if you will. So, chapter 13, verse 18. Okay, it tells you right before that, tells you who's going into the land. Okay, person from each one of the tribes. Chapter 13, verse 18. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, or few or many. Go take a look and see what the people look like. Is their land that they live in good or bad? I mean, is it just a dry desert, or is it good land? Are there cities they live in, or are there cities they live in, encampments or fortifications? Are they just a nomad people, or are they a laid out cities people that got this, that have things maintained and under control? Because remember, if this had just been a complete wilderness and nobody been in the land would have overgrown. Go in there and see what even the cities look like. Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous and bring back some of the fruit of the land. So go in there and go look at all these things. Verse 27. They've been in there. They've been in for 40 days. They come back. In that 40 days, they've probably covered somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 miles of area that they've covered. Chapter 13, verse 27. They reported to Moses, "We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey." Now, does that mean that the rivers had milk rolling down them and that there's just honey rolling down? No. This is a reference to what? Plenty. It's got everything you need. Okay? It's all there. It's all good. And here is some of its fruit. Verse 28 starts with "however." The people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large, and they're fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. All right, these guys, these were historically extra large folks. Okay? They were extra large folks. Then verse 30, skip over it. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, "Let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it." Why? Well, he's a godly man. He knows that God's promised it. But the men who had gone up with him responded, "We can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are." So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land that they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants. Oh yeah, it's got everything, but you know what? Now let's go back. It devours the inhabitants. And all the people we saw in it were of great size. They were large in number, and by the way, we even saw the Nephilim there. I think that was a scare tactic. I think the study Bible here's got that right. Because see, the Nephilim, no matter where you want to put them in and what they were, they got taken out at the flood. Okay? So it's a reference to what? A large, probably this Anak, the people come from Anak, this large group of people, and it's a scare tactic. The Nephilim are there. The descendants of Anak come from Nephilim, right? Those are the people. Look, and probably from this people group, this is probably where Goliath comes from, okay? Comes from him down the ages. He'll come from that people group. Okay? But this is what? It's a scare tactic. Chapter 14. The whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. All the Israelites complained, there's that word again, about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if we had only died in the wilderness." That's a bad one to say, because that's where God's going to use it and come back to. Okay? Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and our children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to slavery in Egypt? So they said to one another, "Let's appoint a leader to go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole assembly of the Israelite community. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of whatever, who were among those who scouted out the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite community, "The land we passed through and explored is an extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into the land, and a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us." Isn't that been His plan all along? Was to bring them there to this point. Okay. Only don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. While the whole community threatened to stone them, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tent of meeting. What are they doing? We're afraid. We can't do this. Look, what did they do? The people listened to the voice of the 10. Okay? Probably that 10 was the loudest in the room. They were hollering louder. They were negative. We can't do this. Look, usually the people you don't want to listen to are the ones that are the loudest in the room. Okay? They're trying to compensate. Okay? Usually it's the ones that are quiet and reserved are usually the ones that are thinking better and will lead the right way. The problem is the mob and the crowd mentality will always follow the loud, the majority. And that always leads people astray. Okay? So instead of listening to the quiet two godly men, they elect to listen to the loudest 10 in the room. Okay? But the Lord shows up. Okay? Skip over chapter 14 to verse 20. The Lord responded, I have pardoned them as you requested, because God was ready to take them out. But Moses, what? Intercedes for them. I've pardoned them as you've requested, yet as surely as I live, and as the whole earth is filled with the Lord's glory, none of the men who have seen my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tested me these 10 times, and did not obey me, will ever see the land I swore to give to their fathers. These were guys who saw the Passover. These were the guys who saw the other 9 plagues. These were the guys who saw when they got to the Red Sea. These are the guys who saw and heard God when He came down on the mountain. These are the guys that saw when God judged. These are the guys that saw when God provided. These are the guys that saw all them folks. Every one of them. It says that they will not even what? They won't even get to see the promised land. Okay? None of those who have despised me will see it. But since my servant Caleb had a different spirit and has remained loyal to me, I will bring him into the land where he is gone, and his descendants will inherit it. Caleb, on the other hand, is going to be a little different. And one other person in just a minute. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the lowlands, turn back tomorrow and head for the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. You're at the door. You were at the gate. You were right there. You were at the point. And God says, tomorrow morning, we're leaving town and we're going back. We're going out in the wilderness. You won't even see the promised land. Okay? Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, how long must I endure this evil community that keeps complaining about me? I have heard the Israelites' complaints that they make against me. Tell them, as surely as I live, this is the Lord's declaration, and this is not pretty. I will do to you exactly as I heard you say. I'm going to give you exactly what you said a minute ago. Your corpses will fall in the wilderness. All of you who were registered at the census, the entire number of you 20 years old or more, because you have complained about me. Again, God's complaint department doesn't exactly have open for business on it. Okay? I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in, except Caleb and Joshua, the son of Nun. I will bring your children whom you said would become plunder into the land you rejected, and they will enjoy it. Those people you said were going to be plundered, they're not going to be plundered. They're going to come back in, and they're going to enjoy it. But you who were slaves will not enjoy the land. But as for you, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Your children will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and bear the penalty for your acts of unfaithfulness until all your corpses lie scattered in the wilderness. You will bear their consequences for your iniquities 40 years based on the number of 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. That's harsh. That's harsh. Okay. And then, end of verse 35, they will come to an end in the wilderness and they will surely die. Verse 37, those men who spread the negative report about me in the land were struck down by the Lord. There was 12 that went out. 10 came back and gave a bad report. Guess what? They didn't get to go back out there in the wilderness and spend 40 years. God struck them down for coming back and giving a bad report. The rest of the folks are going to get exactly what they said. Hey, it'd have been better off if we'd have been just died in the wilderness. Okay, that's where you're going to happen. Look, I took and did a quick calculation. There's roughly 2.5 million people that came out of Egypt. Okay? So if you take those that are over 20 years old or older, I just used a basic, just a quick number. Let's just say 2 million. If there were 2.5 million in total, 2 million people. They're out there for the next 40 years. That's 14,600 days. On average, 136 people a day are going to die over the next 40 years before they get to go back into the promised land. Okay? That's a long time. That's a lot of people falling in the wilderness. Okay? A lot of death. Now, 40 years, all those that saw what God did, they're going to spend the consequences and really the punishment for unbelief, for rebellion, sin against God. They're going to spend 40 years out there while they all perish in the wilderness. Okay? Now, but God is going to keep His promise, but not to the generation that came out, to the generations that followed. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Once they messed up and they realized they messed up, and God's now pronounced, here's what's going to take place. You had a group that followed right here in this next section that decided, you know what, we messed up. So you know what, we don't want to go back out there. We don't want the judgment that you just said. We don't want all that. You know what, we really do want that. And so we're going to go anyway. We're going to go on over there and we're going to take this land and we're going to go in and move in. And so what's going to happen is Moses is going, I wouldn't do that, folks. God's not going with you. The ark's not going with you. God's not going with you. If you go over there, you're going to get yourself whooped. And they went anyway. And guess what happened to them? They got whooped. They got whooped bad. Look, I know, and I've not only heard stories, I've known people. They knew God called and said, I want this. And they didn't follow through. And sometime later they would come back and go, you know what? I think that was the best thing. And so I'm going to do it now when God says no. And they're going to do what? I'm going to go kick every door down. I'm going to do what I can. I'm going there. And it's rebellion against God. Okay? It's rebellion against God. But they knew they messed up and they thought, well, I don't like the consequences. Problem was they died instead. Okay? Now, God does have grace and mercy on these people because He didn't drop the whole nation 20 years old and older dead that moment, did He? No, He put them back out in the wilderness. They did what? They spent the next 40 years out there having families and watching their kids and their grandkids come around. They just didn't get to do what? They didn't go in. They didn't get to live in where God had promised and where God had the provision that would have been there for them. They didn't get to enjoy that. Okay? So God does show grace and He does show mercy, but they still had to live with the consequences of their sin, their rebellion against Him. Now, what do you do with all this? Because remember, all this is for our understanding and our instruction, right? Go back and flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's go back there as we wrap this up real fast. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll start in verse 11. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our instruction. And all those things that were just above that were all those things that we just have seen not only in Numbers, but in Leviticus and Exodus, all those things that are listed there, okay? And it's not that many, but it's pointing all this back to the time that they're out there in that wilderness, okay? For our example, our instruction, okay? Verse 12. So whoever thinks he stands, he must be careful not to fall. He must be careful not to fall. Where you think you stand. What's this talking about? Well, here's the deal. Wherever you think you're strongest in your walk with the Lord, wherever you think you're the strongest, be very, very careful, because that'll be where you fall. Why? That's where you take your eyes off. I got this handled. I let my guard down because I'm fighting other battles. I let my guard down, and guess what happens? Unseen, it blindsides me and I fall. Okay? Wherever you think you're the strongest, be the most careful. Okay? Be the most careful. And then it goes on to say, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to man or humanity. But God is faithful. No temptation. Did they find it when they were out there in that wilderness? Did they fall into temptation? You think it was a temptation to complain? You think it was a temptation to grumble against the Lord? You think it was a temptation? We didn't even talk about the different rebellions that are in this section, but you think it was a temptation for people to try to step over the authority God had laid out because of the power trip that they were wanting to be in Moses' place? You think those things were temptations? Of course they were. Okay? So all the things that we're hard on them sometimes, but if we really stop and think about it, they're no different than we are. Okay? They aren't. They got tempted in all ways, and what we do get to learn from all this is how not to respond. Okay? It's for our instruction, right? So all these bad things that happen to them, the flip side is we don't want all this, right? We're to learn from, well, their pain and suffering. Okay? And so, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to man, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. With the temptation, He will also provide a way out so that you'll be able to bear it. Now, that is not the same as God will not let you go through more than you can handle. That's a lie. That's not in Scripture. Okay? God will let you go through more than you can handle, because if you can handle it, you don't need Him. Okay? But this is talking about temptation. Okay? Look, we all know. Look, you ever had those moments, you know, the temptation's dangling over there, and the phone might ring? I'm just about here and the phone rings. Or you look over and there's something there that gives you that quick opportunity to do what? Stop. 9 times out of 10, what do we do though? Let's try to ignore that but God's what? He's given the opportunity. Problem is we, a lot of times, by the time we get running over here, we ain't worried about it anymore. But God's still faithful to give us what? The opportunity. Okay? What are we to learn? How they handled it is not the right way. And did it cost them? It cost them 40 years. Cost them being buried out in the desert. Those that were in slavery didn't get to enjoy the land God promised because of their rebellion. Okay? So, all the things that they went through, all the complainings, all the rebellion, all the disobedience, all the times that they got themselves into idolatry, into worship of idols, and all these different things that they were doing, God's saying, hey, learn from that because, well, honestly, does anybody want the consequences? Look, we don't want consequences, right? We don't. Nobody wants consequences. But just because we don't want them doesn't mean they don't happen, okay? Going unpunished or without consequences in the short term doesn't mean God agrees with it. It just means that you ain't getting struck down right now, but there will be a day that you will stand before God and give an account. As I said last time, there's still something about Scripture. It's not talking about lost people out there in the New Testament. He's telling saved people to walk in a holy life toward the Lord, okay? Because we're going to stand before the Lord, okay? And using the I can do anything I want because I got the blood, when God's the one who said, be holy for I'm holy, and tells us even in the New Testament to walk in the ways of the Lord, doesn't give us a free pass to just use that. Okay? Doesn't give us that. So if we're saved, the blood of Jesus has covered us, but we should be examining our life in light of not just the New Testament, but as the Bible says, the things that were given to us long ago are for our instruction, okay, on how to live a holy life today.